This is really a very exciting presentation this morning. It's by Ben Wittes. Ben Wittes is someone who is very familiar to people in this audience. He is at the Brookings Institution, but he's probably best known as the editor-in-chief of the Lawfare blog, which really is one of the go-to places. That and Just Security, you really have to read those every day if you're going to be in this area of the law. He is a graduate of Oberlin College. I'm not going to go through everything in his bio because he's done all kinds of writing. He's been an editorial writer for the Washington Post. What I like particularly about Ben is he's able to take very complex ideas and put it into language that we're all going to understand. Now, one of my personal favorites, things that Ben does, is he does podcasts. And I listen to these podcasts while I go jogging, and Ben, I've almost run into more than one tree when he asks somebody something. He asks really good questions, and he gets answers sometimes I don't totally expect, and it distracts me in a way that probably is going to have me fall off the side of a cliff. But the most important thing, people often ask me, especially students, what am I reading? This is what I'm reading, starting today. This is a brand new book that Ben and Gabrielle Bloom up at Harvard, she's still at Harvard, I think, have. It's called The Future of Violence, Robots, Germs, Hackers, and Drones. So here in one book, you can get it all. And really, you know what the genius of this thing is, Ben? Look at that. This means you're actually going to read the damn thing. It's not going to be in that pile of books that are too big to take on. And quite seriously, if Ben Wittes writes it, you want to read it. And Gabriella she's the brains behind it. I think we'll both agree. Ben, without further ado, and oh, by the way, he is a little bit, walking around gingerly, but be aware, especially for the Q&A session, he has a black belt in Taekwondo. So if he doesn't appreciate your question, who knows what's going to happen.
Thank you, Charlie, for that kind introduction. The topic on the schedule is the future of surveillance and NSA in a forever war. But I think, since Charlie started with the book, I can make this very pithy, which is that because the future of violence is bright, it follows that the future of surveillance is also bright. And the brighter the future of violence, the brighter the future of surveillance. So those are conceptually linked ideas, actually, and one of the things we spend a lot of time on in the book is thinking about the relationship between the proliferation of the capacity to attack and the greater surveillance powers that tend to flow out of that, and the greater urge for surveillance that tends to flow out of that. So I said to Steve Vladeck as we were walking in here today that my goal was to give a talk about surveillance that he would agree with all of, or at least 80% of. Now, this is given that we disagree about a lot of stuff related to NSA, this is going to be a real challenge for me, but I'm going to try to do it. And I'm going to give Charlie's request. When he asked me to give this talk, he said he'd heard that I had given a speech at NSA around Constitution Day, and he asked me to give basically the same talk that I gave there. And I agreed to do it and then immediately realized that there was a problem, which was that, so I never use notes when I speak. I always sort of try to speak extemporaneously. And I had made an agreement with NSA that I would give the speech, but they would give me a copy of it because as Charlie said, I run this podcast for Lawfare, and I thought, Constitution Day speech at NSA is kind of a good podcast material. And I specifically didn't ask for any of the Q&A because then, you get into identifying people, and that could be sensitive. But they didn't release the speech because it had to go through declassification review. Now, I am not cleared to receive classified information. This was an audience somewhat larger than this one, all of whom presumably have the highest security clearances. So there's nothing I could possibly tell them. I was the only one speaking. And so we went through this process of it took 5 months, actually, for them to release my own speech to me. I'm not making that up. So I was really worried because I couldn't remember what I'd said, and I didn't have the notes from it, and I couldn't get the speech from NSA. So fortunately, a couple weeks ago, they released my speech to me, and I can now I refreshed my memory of it. So the question I was exploring in the speech, so this was back in September, and I had the previous couple days earlier, before I gave this NSA speech, I'd given a speech at Kenyon College on Constitution Day, and I was at a faculty dinner just before the speech, and they asked whether I was giving any other talks on Constitution Day, and I said, well, yeah, actually, I'm giving the Constitution Day address at NSA. And there is this long, bewildered silence. And finally, one of the professors said, well, they really need it. And so my initial reaction, Chris Segoyan of the ACLU always calls me self-described NSA apologist, Benjamin Wittes. So I was actually thinking of formally changing. My older child has just gone through a formal legal name change. So I was down at Superior Court in Washington, and I was getting the forms for him to change his name. And I was thinking, maybe I should change my name to sort of noted NSA apologist Benjamin Wittes. Michael Kinsley used to have this joke that when he was editor of the New Republic, that he was going to change the name of the New Republic to even the liberal New Republic. So my initial reaction was to sort of argue with this person and to say, hey, look, the NSA has all these, elaborate rules systems. It has, a huge compliance architecture. Can you imagine, given its capacity, what it could do if it were not meaningfully constrained by constitutional and statutory rules? But then I thought about it, and I thought the more interesting question is, why is there this reservoir of mistrust? Despite all the material that's been released, despite all of the public statements that have been made, despite all of the litigation, despite all of the congressional oversight, why is there such a deep reservoir of mistrust that it is a completely predictable, if a little bit amusing thing for a political scientist at a liberal arts college when he's confronted with somebody who's going to go give the Constitution Day speech at NSA? The first thing he says is, well, they really need it. Why is that the reaction? And I started thinking about all the different possible explanations that we give for that and how unsatisfying they all are. So I just want to tick through them for a minute and explain why I don't think they're all true, but I don't think they either individually or collectively explain the mistrust. I want to tick through them and then posit what I think is, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through the explanations I don't think add up to it. I'm going to posit an explanation that I think does explain it, or explain more of it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how that more tectonic level explanation changes in an era of forever war as we come to get more and more surveillance, more and more capacity for surveillance, what are some issues we're going to need to think about in the coming weeks and decades and centuries. All right, so why do people mistrust the intelligence community, signals intelligence in particular? And the first reason you always hear is, well, the intelligence community does a lot of ugly things. And the answer is, yup, sure. It spies on people. We've learned some not flattering things about, U.S. Intelligence operations. But I think this is a deeply unsatisfying explanation because, there's this other organization called the U.S. military, which regularly conducts lethal force operations. It does all kinds of things that, are really quite ugly. And it's absolutely in all polling, the most trusted institution in U.S. public life. Moreover, federal law enforcement does some pretty ugly things too. The FBI can threaten you to put you in a very small box for a very long time, and it can actually do it. And that's before you get to much lesser exertions of government power, like the power to tax, the power to, deport, the power to, all these things that government does that people don't like. So I think the fact that, among the many things that it does, the intelligence community, collects data unwillingly on people and sometimes does nasty things to people, it's certainly true. But it doesn't give rise, to my mind, to the sort of pervasive reaction of mistrust that you get. So the second explanation that you hear is, well, they do this in secret. And there's a lot of secrecy. And again, that's absolutely true. As the 5-month delay in releasing these words to me to give to you is one trivial, silly example. But again, it's much easier to trust somebody to do ugly things in public when there's a certain level of transparency about it than when they're doing it, very secretly. So again, I'm not doubting the truth of the explanation, except to say that it doesn't remotely account for the severity of the reaction. There are other institutions in American public life, again, think of the military, that do nasty things in public. The military, there's a lot you don't know about special operations, right? There are other organizations we trust a great deal that also behave with a lot of secrecy. Not always because of classified information. Think of that much vaunted American institution, the United States Supreme Court. They won't let you bring cameras in there. And by the way, if you want to know the pre-decisional discussions between the justices, you got to wait till one of them dies. And, you can't go in there and find out about the process by which an opinion was produced. So in one sense, they produce public work, but in another sense, they're as black a box as it gets. There's a huge amount of secrecy in the government that is caused not by anybody trying to keep secrets, but just by the fact that a decision is made that nobody's likely to FOIA. So secrecy is, again, part of the explanation. It's not, to me, an adequate explanation. So then the third example that you always hear is, well, the intelligence community came by this by the abuses of the pre-church committee era. There was a long history of civil rights abuses, and that is, again, true. No, I wouldn't remotely argue that the history of the community is pristine. But I would also say that you would think, if that were the explanation, that a subsequent 30-year record of intelligence community coexistence with the rule of law would ameliorate the suspicion to some degree, and I think probably a greater degree than it has. So again, 3 explanations, all of them are a piece of the puzzle, and yet when I think about them individually and collectively, none of them gets me to that Kenyon College professor who says, gee, they really need it. So I want to posit what I think is not the missing link in this conversation, but a missing link in this conversation. And that is the somewhat ambivalent relationship that the intelligence community has with the idea of neutral principles. Now, constitutional democracies, as you all know, require neutral principles. The basic idea that the same law applies to me as applies to, I have the right to stand here and speak in front of you, and the Ku Klux Klansman has the right to stand up in front of a group of people who want to listen to him too, as much as I might not like that. The idea that there is equal application of the law to different people is foundational to the entire constitutional fabric of the country and to all countries that purport to live under the rule of law. Now, I think the intelligence community necessarily has a somewhat ambivalent relationship with that. And let me give you just 2, I think that operates at 2 distinct levels. One is that they don't actually think of the same people doing the same things as equally entitled to or prohibited from doing those things under the law. And the second is that they do not claim, they do not acknowledge that they are bound by the same rules as everybody else. So let me unpack that a little bit. Imagine for a minute a Chinese Edward Snowden. He would have to go to somewhere other than Hong Kong, I suppose. But he takes a whole lot of information from the People's Liberation Army, and he goes somewhere and he starts giving it to us, or giving it to journalists. Now, we would have a whole different vocabulary, both legally and socially, to talk about that person than we do about Edward Snowden. First of all, he would be, we would use words like agent, hero, asset, instead of words like criminal, traitor, theft, right? We would use words, we would have all sorts of systems designed to protect him rather than systems designed to catch him and punish him. Because in fact, we do not have a neutral principle that says, stealing information, classified information from governments is bad. We have a non-neutral principle that says stealing classified information from our government is bad. That's pretty, now I will actually defend that. I don't think I'm more chauvinistic than the next guy, but I will defend that as a matter of policy and national prerogative, but I will not defend that on grounds that there is a neutral principle there. So a second example, General Hayden, who used to run the NSA, has this wonderful quotation that became the title for Alex Gibney's very brilliant movie about WikiLeaks. Has anybody ever seen this movie? You should all go see it. It's a startlingly great movie called We Steal Secrets. And the title comes from this interview with General Hayden, in which General Hayden is describing the business of the intelligence community. And he says, we steal secrets. We steal other countries' secrets. And I was thinking when I saw this, how many former heads of agencies would describe the day-to-day business of their agency with a word that would, in other contexts, always connote criminal conduct. The head of, the Labor Department doesn't say, we steal things, right? And if you think about what the intelligence community does, It's not simply that it does things that are ugly. It's that it does things that are, in almost all other contexts, illegal. A friend of mine at CIA once joked to me that if it were legal under local law to do it, you wouldn't need to have a CIA. That's why we have a State Department. He's right, right? You have a clandestine intelligence service because you want to violate some neutral principle. That's very hard to reconcile with what we think of as the foundations. Not impossible, but it's hard to reconcile with what we think of as the foundations for constitutional democracy. Now, when the great Ashley Deeks listened to this talk when I podcasted it, and she wrote me a note that said, you make a really interesting point, but hey, the military has all sorts of prerogative authority that would otherwise be illegal too. And you note that they're the most trusted institution in the federal government. How do you explain that? And I think the answer is the military does not observe the same neutral principles that other institutions do vis-a-vis US citizens. But it has a set of neutral principles vis-a-vis other militaries, right? So, and it scrupulously applies them. That's the laws of war. And so you can say the military does not have the same rules that I do, but it has rules, and it's the same rules that it expects other militaries to behave under. The intelligence community is unique in that its foundational exercise is designed to do things that you're not otherwise normally allowed to do because it's convenient and useful to do those things sometimes. Okay, so the question is, as we go forward, as we all become more and more scared of more and more actors, as we have this forever war, what do we do about this problem? Is this problem resolvable? And I think the answer is no, it's not. The tension is too embedded, too endemic to the essential nature of the project to be resolvable. However, I do think there are a few things that as we go forward, we can ameliorate it more or less, depending on how we think about these things. I want to mention just a few, and I'm going to try to do this quite quickly so that we have time for some discussion. The first is transparency. Now, there is a whole new gospel of transparency in the intelligence community, and to some degree, I accept it all, but I'm a little bit of a, it's a vogue new idea, and like all vogue new ideas, it has its limits. I sort of don't believe you can do signals intelligence in public. That said, when I say transparency, I mean something a little bit different from document releases, policy statements. All of that's good, all of it's valuable, but I'm talking about something a little different. I'm talking about being open and straightforward about the tension that I've just described, and being open and straightforward about the contradictions of having an intelligence community, a powerful intelligence community in a rule of law society. So I was in Germany last summer. If you ever want a really fun experience, go to a German university to defend the NSA. And this was unlike anything I've ever done before in my life. And I felt like I was standing there, felt like I needed to be wearing a 10-gallon hat and boots. And the theme of my talk, I figured as long as I was going to go, I was going to be sort of unapologetic and say all the things that government officials can't say. So the theme of my talk was just grow up. And I told them basically two stories. One was the story of Jonathan Pollard, which is at the height of the U.S.-Israel relationship. The Israelis run an agent against us. We catch him. He's sentenced to life in prison, which he's still serving. And the aggregate effect on U.S.-Israeli relationship over time is zero. This is a devastating agent, by the way. So that's one. We were big boys and girls about it. And second story is the story that, my reaction when I hear Americans whining about Chinese espionage in cyber. And the idea that this is some great moral wrong that they're committing against us. Grow up. It's our job to figure out how to build our systems so that that's harder rather than easier. It's our job to behave in a way that changes their strategic calculus of what is in their strategic interest to do to us, given certain capabilities. But this idea that the Chinese are going to define their behavior with reference to anything other than their own perceived interests is just silly. And it's beneath our dignity as a bunch of grown-ups to pretend that, we're going to wag our fingers at them until they stop stealing our stuff. And so I said to the Germans, look, this is what I'm going to say to you. We're two real countries. You guys don't always agree about things. We're going to spy on you. Just grow up. And I really expected the Germans to be really offended and really upset by this. And quite to my surprise, I was received extremely warmly. And the next day, actually, one of the major German newspapers had a story that said, "Brookings scholar to Germany, just grow up," was the sort of headline. And it got the details of the speech quite wrong, but that's okay. It got the message just right. And I was surprised at the reaction, which was not hostile, because it turns out that Europeans don't actually want to be patronized and don't actually want to be treated like children. And we can have a conversation that's on the basis of, hey, there a certain level of transparency about the things that actually do divide us. So what I would say is, we need to have not just transparency of policy, not just transparency of court opinions, not just but transparency and candor about underlying differences of values that I think are real. And I think the conversation would be greatly improved over time as we move into this period where this stuff is not going away, if we just laid it out a little bit on the table and let people know where we part company from them, where we agree, and really where we don't agree. So the second thing that I think we can do, this is just two technical areas that are just going to require a huge amount of thought. And if we think about them well, we will do better in alleviating this tension than if we don't. So the first of them is what I call cyborgization. I wrote a paper last year with a brilliant young scholar named Jane Chong about the question of whether we're all becoming cyborgs. So last year, 8 justices of the Supreme Court signed an opinion that contained the line, and I'm paraphrasing, that a proverbial visitor from another planet would think that the cell phone was so integrated into our bodies that it was part of the human anatomy. Now, of course, what we're talking about is a search of a cell phone on arrest. But another way to look at it is that 8 justices of the Supreme Court think that we're cyborgs or think that we're somewhere on that spectrum. A huge amount of what the intelligence community does is predicated on the idea that we are not cyborgs, right? So the 215 program, for example, is based on this idea that, in from these 1970s era opinions that, telephone metadata is data that you voluntarily given to a third party. You didn't have to give it to a third party. And since you did, it's not Fourth Amendment protected. Now, I don't mean to get into a long debate about the third party doctrine. But let me give you another example of a metadata program that you could justify on the same basis. So pacemakers produce a lot of data, and they're designed to have that data retrievable without open heart surgery for obvious reasons. Now you can imagine the pacemaker metadata program, right? Where you can maybe tell whether somebody is getting ready to do a terrorist act by sudden changes in the way they're, it's hard to imagine what the utility of it would be. You can collect it remotely, and it sure seems like data voluntarily given to a third party, right? You didn't have to take that pacemaker. You could have just died. And yet I think if we imagine Smith v. Maryland as having presented with the pacemaker program, I think like nobody imagines that the Supreme Court would have written Smith v. Maryland about a pacemaker. The more integrated we get with our technology, the more the human elements of our beings expresses themselves through these phones that 8 justices of the Supreme Court already don't think of as entirely severable from us. The more the doctrine is that the intelligence community relies on for a huge swath of collection is going to come under pressure. And the basic tension here, I think you can sum it up pretty simply. As we integrate with technology more and more and more, we are becoming beings that have technological components and biological components. The human components have rights, and the technical components are subject easily to surveillance. And the question is, as you become a unified being, are you a being with the trackability and surveillance capacities of the machine and the rights also of the machine? And I believe the answer for the intelligence community is that we will not tolerate that as a society. And that means there will be a lot of pressure on the doctrines that they are relying upon. So one question as you go forward and think about surveillance in the forever war is, are we surveillance of cyborgs? Or are we thinking of this as surveillance of people who use tools? Second issue is density. We have this terrible trend in our discussions of these issues. We pass these laws, and then they become out of date in some way, usually but not always because of technological development. And then so what do? We amend them and we glom more stuff onto them. And the result is, if you look at FISA now, unless you are Bill Banks, Steve Vladeck, you do not understand it. Promise. You can spend your life, you have a choice. You can spend most of your life trying to understand the intelligence law, or you can resign yourself to the fact that you don't understand intelligence law. That is corrosive. It's corrosive of democratic understanding of what the government can do. It all comes from good things. We see a problem, we try to remedy the problem in law. It's democracy in action. It actually shows how, this is an area where Congress, in all its dysfunction, has lovingly taken care of this statute for 30 years by updating it, by responding to new problems. And all of it has made the surveillance law about as penetrable as the tax code. And people object to it and misunderstand it for exactly the same reason that they misunderstand the tax code, which is, and dislike the tax code, which is it's too complicated to understand. It must be serving somebody's interests other than mine. And they're right. So when you think about the future of surveillance in the NSA and the forever war, one question that I think we just have to confront is, are we going to keep making this more and more complicated, less and less accountable, less and less possible for citizens to know the answer to the basic question, when will and when will not their government spy on them? And that's what we're doing. With the best of intentions, we're making it impossible to understand the answer to that question. One more thought, and then I will leave off. We have to think about what is going to replace the 1978 compromise. So 1978, we had a grand compromise where we said, okay, it is unacceptable for people to, the intelligence community to behave the way it's been behaving. We need these we need these oversight mechanisms, so we're going to build 3 great ones, right? One is the intelligence committees, one is internal executive branch reviews of various types, and the third is the FISA court. And they all are predicated on the same basic idea, which is we can't do oversight in this area the way we do it in every other area, which is to say everybody gets to see things and make a democratic judgment. So we're going to create these designated proxies that can do it in secret. It'll stay secret to the public, but there will be sets of proxies for Congress, for the courts, for the president in overseeing intelligence programs. And what the last 2 years has shown, at least to me, is that as a society, we don't believe in that compromise anymore. We are much more radically populist than we used to be, and I think we need to start thinking about what the structure looks like, if there is a structure, and this is a decades-long project, but what is the mechanisms by which we're going to oversee the intelligence community? We all care about these issues much more than we used to. When I was first interested in the FISA court, no one had ever heard of it. I think I was like the second person who ever wrote an article about it. My parents, I could not convince them that it's interesting. And when you're a young writer and you can't convince your mother, you know, it was a bad scene. Now everybody has an opinion about this stuff, despite the fact that this law is so dense that they can't possibly understand what they have an opinion about. We care about this a lot, and the reason is cyborgization. The reason is that this stuff didn't used to affect our lives, and now it did. And in this prospective sense, as you look forward, it's going to affect your life more and more and more and more. Because someday, somebody will want, not a pacemaker metadata program, but a program that collects something that's, you know, more biologically innate to who you are. And it'll be doable. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll be happy to take any questions y'all have. Yes, sir.
I'm Russ Kilpatrick. I'm a retired senior Air Force officer, and like you, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a physician. I've had occasion in the past, in knowing some NSA folks personally, to have conversations with them that had nothing to do with NSA, but gave me reason to have, shall we say, a bit of concern about their personal integrity. Given the conduct of many of our federal officials today, what role does personal integrity and personal values in the conduct of NSA have in our concerns about policy with NSA?
Well, as with any agency that exercises enormous power with diminished accountability, one of the big and ultimately the most important answer to the question of trust is the question of who you think is running it. I mean, the FBI is an organization I have a lot of trust for when James Comey is running it. and very little trust for when J. Edgar Hoover is running it. So I think personal integrity makes a huge difference. You want to build systems that don't depend on personal integrity, that are, and yet, at the end of the day, they do to some degree, and therefore, you know, you want to create policy as though people were not policy, but you also want to keep in mind that people are. Yes.
Ben, I'd like to ask you about your comments on neutral principles and the concept of use extra bellum that we've talked about previously. So I appreciate your comment about these neutral principles applied by the military in the context of war and the way that we go about employing them. But as you know, I'm particularly interested in the concept of states' rights to employ national security activities outside of armed conflict, something that I've called use extra bellum. And here's what I'm interested in. You talked about certain domestic revisions, but I wonder, as you're traveling to Germany and elsewhere and facing certain criticisms, whether there might be neutral principles like the law of war that you see as applicable to certain broader national security activities. And I think surveillance is the perfect example. It's probably the thing that cuts across both war and an outside of war context. And cyber is another place, just looking for those instances where maybe there's room for emergence of new principles of neutrality or neutral principles, or maybe even application of certain neutral principles that we've applied in other contexts, but we might bring to bear in our broader national security apparatus.
It's a great question, and it's actually, so if you look on Lawfare over the last couple of days, Ashley and I actually wrote a little article teasing exactly that idea, that maybe the answer to developing a certain enhanced trust in the intelligence community over time is the military model, where you develop enough international norms that those function as the neutral principles that, you know, the law of war is for the military. So there are a couple problems with that. One is that because almost all intelligence activity is by its nature covert, the compliance mechanisms are not obvious at all, right? I mean, how do you, if everybody's denying everything, and if a lot of what is being done isn't ever being detected, it's very hard to figure out what the compliance systems are. And the second is that I think the development of these norms is actually very difficult. I mean, it's a kind of pre-Liber code, you know, era in which we simply don't agree about what is permissible and what is not permissible. So getting to any kind of an international norm is very hard, and enforcing it is even harder. That said, look, I think it's part of the answer. And now, to the larger question about use extra bellum, look, the more the military behaves like the intelligence community, the more it's going to have the same problems in this area that the intelligence community has. And I think, you know, that is one reason that's one reason why we have a Title 10 and a Title 50, right? And we've tried to separate them. And it's one reason why the blurring of the two is, you know, has pitfalls for the military, which isn't to say don't do it. There's a lot of good reasons. There's a lot of good reasons for the military to be engaged in stuff that we might traditionally have thought of as intelligence activities or intelligence operations. But it will carry costs, and I think this is if you buy my thesis, this is probably one of those costs. Okay. If you don't mind. One more, and then we'll stop. And I'll be very brief.
Hey, Tony Kolang. Just positing another potential theory for why your professor answered the way he did. could part of it be the sustained long-term negative campaign that we see in the media and also in Hollywood against the Intel institution, similar to maybe what we see against Congress, but not against the military, where we seem to have the opposite effect? And I'm wondering how much that might impact that answer.
Right. So, you know, I think it absolutely does, right? I think, you know, most Americans, according to a wonderful poll by Amy Ziegart at Stanford, believe the NSA does coercive interrogations, right? So, you know, you are dealing with a degree of public ignorance that contributes to it, and there's certainly, you know, the Jack Bauer effect really, you know, does enhance that. On the other hand, you have to ask which is chicken and which is egg here. One of the reasons the media does this is because they're playing into pre-existing sentiment that's useful for purposes of selling movies, right? And so I don't, you know, there is definitely a self-reinforcing cycle there, and your point is well taken. Thank you very much.
I think there's a huge civil-military relations impact to it worth exploring. And it does bring to mind that we have so many great speakers here, and I do wish that they would reduce to books, as Ben has done. Mike, I know you're as so